From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture.
Frequent listeners of Pollination know that one of the biggest pollinator-dependent crops here in the Pacific Northwest, from the lower mainland of British Columbia right throughout Washington and here into Oregon, are high bush blueberry. High bush blueberries are delicious fruit that are grown here, and it requires a lot of honeybee colonies to pollinate. And in addition, there are a number of native bees that will visit blueberry flowers, notably bumblebees. Now, one thing that's been happening in the blueberry industry over the last few years is a lot of development. There's new practices that are being employed. There's new cultivars that are being used, and it's unclear how best to optimize pollination. And to this end, there's a new USDA-funded project that I'm a participant in, led by Dr. Rufus Isaac at Michigan State University, that is coming up with a pollination planner, a little tool so that a blueberry grower knows how to make all these different trade-offs in terms of how many colonies they need, when the colonies need to be delivered, maybe how the orchard is planted. Do they need different cultivars? All that is the focus of this project. And to talk about that project this week, at least the starting point, I have Dr. Lisa DeVetter. Now, Dr. DeVetter is a longtime collaborator of mine since I've been here at OSU. She's an associate professor of small fruits at the Mount Vernon Research Center for Washington State University. She's worked a lot on pollination. You may remember a past episode we had with Matt Arrington, where research that she'd done with Dr. Arrington revealed that stocking rate, you can actually put more bees per acre in some blueberry fields and actually get a benefit. So in this week, we're going to hear about the first glimpse of this pollination planner, and we're going to have a number of other episodes highlighting this planner. And also at the very end of the episode, I want to, for you, if you're a beekeeper in the area, if you're a blueberry grower, there is a survey and you can win some prizes. And this survey is really key to making this planner really usable for the industry. So please follow the show notes and you will be able to plug into this planner. Okay, without further ado, here's Dr. Lisa DeVetter on blueberry pollination this week on Pollination. I am so excited to finally have Dr. Lisa DeVetter on the Pollination Podcast. Welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Anthony. I'm very excited to be here.
Yeah, we've had a lot of conversations over the years, and I started the podcast in some ways to capture those conversations for various people. So I'm so delighted to have you. And I guess, you and I've had extended conversations on pollination of high bush blueberries. And I want to start by just laying out some groundwork. What is the pollination biology of high bush blueberry? Are insect pollinators absolutely necessary? And is outcrossing to plants of a different cultivar, as we've heard in a previous episode with cherry, is that necessary for blueberry?
Yeah, great. Well, I'm happy to talk about it. Blueberry is one of my favorite crops that I get to work with as a horticulturalist. So high bush blueberry is the one that we're focusing on. It's the northern high bush blueberry one. That's what we grow here in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. It is grown primarily in these large blocks with copious amounts of flowers, and they are in need of insect-mediated pollination. So our current cultivars don't need cross-pollination to the best of our knowledge. That's something that several other collaborators are exploring, but for the most part, it's not a huge priority. And part of that, we can see it based on these really large blocks of, say, cultivar Duke or cultivar Draper. They're still able to set fruit and size them up really appropriately without cross-pollination.
Okay, so let me get this straight. So that it may be, you say there's ongoing research into this, but right now the current practice is growers will have a solid block of something and they're setting fruit even though the bees may be just, visiting in that cultivar.
Right, exactly. But that doesn't mean, though, that we can get larger berries from cross-pollination from our current cultivars. I think as we start with newer cultivars that are coming onto the market and are becoming increasingly utilized by growers, those might need more cross-pollination, particularly for some of the varieties or cultivars that have southern highbush blueberry in the germplasm, because they do have a greater cross-pollination need.
Oh, that's interesting. I did not know that. So there's some high bush blueberries that we have here that have southern population genetics in them.
Correct. Yep.
Really?
And that's really where some of the interesting questions are as we start looking at these new and improved cultivars. We have to figure out what are their pollination needs. Are they going to be better if we have a pollinizer in these production systems? So those are still some remaining questions out there.
And just before we move off on that, I find this fascinating. So there is this turnover of cultivars. Is this happening very quickly? And, what's kind of prompting this shift to new cultivars?
Yeah, well, it's something that, a lot of growers understand that the cornerstone to disease tolerance and improved production is through utilization of germplasm. And we haven't had a lot of new cultivars out there. Meanwhile, we have companies like Fall Creek and Driscoll's. They're really great companies, and they're doing a lot when it comes to developing new germplasm. And they're coming out and they're releasing them, and we're trying to assess them. And growers are trying to adopt them as they start to modernize their production systems.
Fantastic. Well, I know the scope of your job is very broad, and I'm always impressed whenever I talk to you. You have another collaboration and you do everything from, mulches and things like that. But you have turned your attention to blueberry pollination over the last few years. You've done some really great research in it. And I guess the first, the question I have associated with it, is there problems associated with blueberry pollination? And if there is, when did you start to notice that, blueberry pollination in Washington might not be completely understood, that there were some open questions worth devoting research to?
Yeah, I'd be happy to elaborate because it's such I do a lot of projects, but pollination is my favorite area, if I can say that. Hopefully my mulching colleagues aren't listening in. But, it's really interesting because it's such a complex system, and I'm always learning and humbled by it. So I came to Washington State University, and I really try to do grower-driven research and address knowledge gaps to help with their production. And when I came right away, one of the concerns was fruit set and pollination. And so, the first project that I did was just to try to understand what pollination levels were like and starting to build my knowledge. And it became pretty clear after the first few years of research that we were achieving a pollination deficit in our blueberry fields. And so that kind of led to this cascade of new collaborations and new research projects to try to figure out how can we improve pollination for the growers that we're working with. And also help the beekeepers too. That's also been fun to develop these relationships with beekeepers and try to help them provide a better service as well.
And I remember, what we had a previous episode, quite a few years ago with one of your students at the time, Matt Arrington, and that, you started to notice with things like stocking density that previously conceived, limits were actually maybe not applicable anymore.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot more work that can be done there. But what we found out through Matt Arrington's research, or I should say Dr. Arrington now,
that's right,
the degree program, which makes us so proud as academic parents. But what he found was that increasing hive density from the standard, which was 4 hives to the acre, will lead to increased bee visitation and fruit set and berry size for Duke, for our environmental conditions. Specify that because it's kind of unknown how that might affect other cultivars. And I think there's a lot more out there. And you've done some great work on this topic, looking more at the importance also of colony strength.
I sometimes think, Washington and Oregon, and then also our listeners in British Columbia, this is all one region. But, working with you, I've kind of come to realize that Washington, especially eastern Washington, where a lot of blueberries are grown, is a different pollination condition than the Willamette Valley. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the kind of problems associated with pollination in Washington specifically?
Yeah, well, here in northwestern Washington, one of our main limitations is our environmental conditions. So when the blueberries are blooming, our typical conditions are cool and wet, not very conducive for honeybee foraging. So that's one bottleneck that we can experience in the northwestern part of the state. Also, and you had the opportunity to speak with Maxime, who is a postdoc that is working in the program. He also has been teaching me a lot about native pollinators, which are fascinating. In our landscape and new production system, blueberry is from out in the Northeast, and we're growing them here in the Pacific Northwest in these large blocks. We're also probably not having a lot of contribution from native pollinators, or at least that's one of the hypotheses out there that can be tested.
Well, fantastic. Well, I think this opens up a can of worms that I want to pick up after the break. We have, you are part of a new project, a large project, a national project to develop a pollination planner. So let's take a quick break, and I want you to just give me the broad strokes of this project. We're going to be hearing in this podcast a lot from this research over time, but let's take a quick break. We'll come right back and we'll learn about the pollination planner. Okay, fantastic. We're back. Now, you're part of this team. You're kind of the anchor here in the Pacific Northwest of a project that's led by Dr. Rufus Isaacs at Michigan State University. And it's to develop a pollination planner for blueberry growers. In broad strokes, what would such a planner do, and how might a grower in the Pacific Northwest use such a planner?
Yeah, so broad strokes, what we're trying to create is a decision aid tool. So something that is data driven, that we can make accessible to growers, possibly even beekeepers and consultants, where they can access it and understand how modifying practices on their farms, such as stocking density for a particular cultivar in a particular region, will affect the success when it comes to fruit set, yield, and return on that pollination investment. So that's the broad strokes. Any questions you want me to kind of narrow down on?
Yeah, I was thinking about it, and it seems like a kind of like a complicated problem, because as you mentioned at the beginning, the industry is changing, and there's all sorts of like data gaps. I imagine to be able to get a planner like this off the ground, there has to be a lot of data generated to be able to populate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So this project, it's 4 years long, and the planner, we're working on trying to create it as quickly as possible. But a lot of the project is actually developing the data that's currently lacking for our modern production systems, including our modern cultivars.
So I know there's multiple objectives, and I know one of the objectives is stocking rate and colony placement. Can you tell us a little bit about that part of the project?
Yeah, so that's the part that we've been working on, as well as with your program, Andoni. So we've been looking at a cost-benefit analysis of different honeybee stocking densities, as well as placement strategies. So more work on stocking density, which we had done initially, which is great. There's still a lot, I think, that can be developed there. And then the placement strategies, which is looking at, does it make a difference if you disperse your hives across a field, or do you cluster them away? We see different practices for different reasons, and we're hopefully going to be able to answer that question and understand, too, if there is an increased risk of pesticide exposure based on placement strategy.
Oh, yeah, I remember this. I've seen this myself driving around blueberry fields, and I've heard beekeepers talk about this. Sometimes growers will put a pallet of bees right up against the crop, and they'll just spread them all out, the idea being that if they're spread out and close to the crop, they'll get better pollination, although some people will do the opposite and put the bees far back from the crop and maybe out of the spray zone area. And I guess it's an open question whether that influences pollination or whether the bees get less exposure.
Absolutely. And we're hoping that question will no longer be open by the end of this year with another round of data collection next year.
And so some other aspects, I know there's a climatological part that, especially I imagine with this past year in mind, with strange weather temperatures, growers being able to understand how temperature during pollination might affect the bloom and all that. Also the performance of the bees. I imagine that's part of this project as well, right?
Yeah, we're definitely encompassing weather because it's affecting both the blueberry plant in terms of pollination and development of those berries. And then it's also affecting our honeybee foragers. So the environmental aspects include looking at bloom phenology based on variable weather conditions, also looking at honeybee foraging activity based on environmental conditions, and then just kind of understanding how temperature and humidity affect pollination itself. This was something that was brought up by Dr. Rachel Mallinger at the University of Florida, where they're dealing with really humid conditions. And she was mentioning how, for them, there's a concern that if it's really humid, then the pollen won't release effectively, and that could diminish pollination.
Oh, that's right. I remember and you've done a bunch of this work where you've been extracting pollen. For some of this research, you have a control where you get the pollen off the plants and you actually artificially load the pollen onto the plant. I imagine when it's wet, that doesn't happen very well.
No, we learned pretty quickly this year, don't try when it's wet or if there's any moisture on the plants because it does not release.
Okay, have I covered most of the experiments that are happening here in Washington and Oregon to generate the data for the planner? Have I missed anything? There's another aspect with compatibility, is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. We're looking at pollination requirements and attraction of new and existing cultivars. So, that we're kind of still refining that as a project team. Initially, there was going to be work here in the Northwest. We might just more, collaborate with the students in Michigan and Florida on looking at those pollination requirements for cultivars that are important for our growing region here in the Pacific Northwest.
Now, the final thing I wanted to talk to you about, and maybe this should have been the first thing, is there's this exciting new production survey, and the work is happening with our at WSU to sort of figure out the economics for the decision making tool. And there's a production survey. Can you tell us a little bit about this production survey and how growers can get involved and just tell us a little bit, pitch it to the growers out in the audience right now.
Yeah, pitch it. Well, maybe I'll start by saying, each state, when you do the survey, you get into a raffle to win a prize. So hopefully that'll increase participation. But, I want to underscore, we really have a hard time moving forward and coming up with practical, realistic recommendations without input from the growers. So these surveys are really important. What this survey is trying to do is get a baseline on your pollination practices on your farm. And then, there's, some information too that Suzette Galinato, who is our economist working on the project team, is also interested in. And that will allow us to do an effective cost-benefit analysis for the different stocking densities and placement strategies and inform our pollination prediction model, where we want to include understanding what the return on investment is on these different pollination practices that are under investigation. So where you can access it, we've been promoting it. So the Washington Blueberry Commission has promoted it, the Oregon Blueberry Commission as well. And then our friends with Peerbolt Crop Consulting have also been advertising for it. And then it can be found in the Small Fruit Update as well. So look at it there. It might take you 10 minutes, but the feedback is really valuable.
Oh, and we'll link it in the show notes as well.
Excellent.
The other thing I'd say is if you get into the survey right now, I mean, you're at the front, you're sort of in the driver's seat, and you'll be available to get updates on all this information on the planner. You may be like one of the first kind of people with the planner in your hands. If you take the survey, we'll know who you are, and we'll make sure you're at the front of the row.
Excellent. I'm convinced. I want to sign up for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Take 10 minutes. It's really great. And this is, you can get a prize, and you can also just, as the planner is being developed, you'll really help shape how it looks. That's excellent. Okay, let's take one more quick break. We have a segment that we ask all our guests on the show. I'm really curious what your answer is going to be. So here we go. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. All right, we're back. I have these 3 questions for you. First, book recommendation on pollinators, or maybe even blueberries in your case. What's a book that we need to have?
Well, this one was pretty easy for me, and it's going to sound a little boring because Maxine recommended the same one. So Dave Golson's books are fabulous. My favorite is The Sting in the Tail, and it's about his adventures with bumblebees. Such a fabulous book. I'm rereading it right now because it's so dense, but also so fun and approachable.
I know. I wish I was in his household as a kid.
I know. And when I read that book, I reconsider my career choice. I'm like, I should have been an entomologist. So that's a good book.
Well, it's great. I really, there's a number of you in the U.S. who do both. You're actually quite good at doing pollination biology, but you know the crop. I think that's a rare breed. And it's such an effective and powerful tool for growers because those two things can really be brought together well.
Yeah. Well, it's good to have good entomology collaborators with expertise in pollination as well. So it goes both ways.
Well, it brings me to the next question. As somebody who has that, I'm as an extension person, as somebody who works in multiple crops and has multiple interests, is there a tool in all of this work that you do that you find indispensable?
Sure. It's going to be a very millennial answer, and it's my cell phone. I don't know if anyone's ever told you that, but my cell phone it's a map, it's GPSing, the only thing it doesn't have is like a bottle opener and a pocket knife, but other than that, it's pretty much perfect. It's really useful, and you can collect data from it. You can take pictures. So I would be lost without my phone.
It's amazing what you can now do. I remember I worked in low bush blueberries years ago, and I took plot photos that was the first time I kind of used, and it was still glitchy, but now it's like everything syncs up to the cloud. You don't lose anything, and you can really use it as a data inputting tool highly effectively. Yeah,
it's very efficient. So that's my millennial answer.
That's a great answer. And you're not the first one, too. I have to say, it is a popular answer.
Okay. For a reason.
For a good reason. Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the last question is, do you have a pollinator species that when it comes by, it's like, I love that pollinator species?
It's not a particular species, and it reflects my book choice, Bumbus. So I just love bumblebees. They're fascinating just when you think about their biology and also their pollinator contribution. So they're just amazing pollinators, and they always catch my eye whenever I see them.
The thing I guess with blueberries is this is a bee that, is really well suited for vaccinium plants. It has the ability to get that pollen out of the porocidal anthers. It's a nice match. I could see why it's high on your list there.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So that sonication and how they're able to pollinate blueberries is a good match.
Well, good luck with your research. We're really looking forward to it'd be great to have you back on the show later. I know you're doing work. You've done work with attractants. You've done works with stocking density. There's so many questions about blueberry pollination. It's such an important crop for the region. So we will be catching up with you later, but good luck with your research.
Great. Well, thank you, Anthony, and it's nice to have you on the project team as well.
Thank you so much for listening. The show is produced by Quinn Sinan Neal, who's a student here at OSU in the New Media Communications program, and the show wouldn't even be possible without the support of the Oregon Legislature, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and Western SARE. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on the website, which is at pollination.podcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's several ways to connect with me. The first one is you can visit the website and leave an episode-specific comment. You can suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. But you can do the same things on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook by visiting the Oregon Bee Project. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next week.